Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a saying, older than the Imperium itself, that the most dangerous enemy is the one you never see coming. In the sprawling, blood-soaked universe of Warhammer 40,000, where continent-sized warships darken the skies of 1,000 worlds, and gods made of raw psychic malice feast upon the suffering of trillions, there exists a force so enigmatic, so layered in deception and contradiction, that even after 10,000 years of study, the Imperium of man cannot say with certainty whether they are friend or foe. They are the 20th Legion, the last of the Emperor's great hosts to be formally recognized, the final sons to march beneath the Aquila during humanity's greatest endeavor. They call themselves many things: the Unbroken Chain, the Children of Eris, the Left Hand of Darkness, the Azure Serpent. But the galaxy knows them best by two names. The first is the Alpha Legion. The second, whispered in corridors of power from Terra to the furthest reaches of the Eastern Fringe, is simply this: Hydra Dominatus. Settle in. Get comfortable. Because tonight, we are going to peel back every layer we can, sift through every contradictory record, examine every blood-soaked battlefield account, and try to understand what might be the most fascinating, most maddening, and most brilliantly conceived faction in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. This is the story of the Alpha Legion. And I should warn you right now, before we even begin, that everything you are about to hear could be a lie. That is not a disclaimer I offer lightly. It is, in fact, the very essence of who these warriors are. To understand the Alpha Legion, yet you first have to abandon certain assumptions that work perfectly well when discussing other Space Marine legions. With the Ultramarines, you can trace a clear lineage from their founding on Terra, through their exploits in the Great Crusade, to their role as the backbone of the modern Imperium. With the Space Wolves, you have Fenris, you have Leman Russ, you have a culture of fierce independence and barely restrained savagery that makes them immediately recognizable and understandable. Even the more mysterious legions, the Raven Guard with their affinity for shadow warfare, or the Thousand Sons with their obsessive pursuit of arcane knowledge, have narratives that follow logical paths from origin to present day. The Alpha Legion has none of that, or rather, it has all of that, several times over, in versions that contradict each other so thoroughly that Imperial scholars have spent lifetimes trying to determine which accounts are real and which are elaborate fabrications. The Inquisition, that most paranoid and resourceful of Imperial institutions, has dedicated entire ordos to tracking and eliminating the Alpha Legion. They have declared the Legion destroyed no fewer than 3 times across the millennia: in the 31st millennium, the 32nd millennium, and the 39th millennium. Each time, the Alpha Legion has resurfaced, seemingly undiminished, to resume its shadow war against enemies that may or may not include the Imperium itself. That last point is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it sits at the heart of everything that makes the Alpha Legion so compelling. Every other traitor legion made a clear choice during the Horus Heresy. The World Eaters gave themselves over to Khorne's eternal rage. The Death Guard embraced Nurgle's pestilent gifts. The Thousand Sons bound themselves to Tzeentch's ever-shifting schemes. The Emperor's children lost themselves in Slaaneish's bottomless pursuit of sensation. Even the more independent traitor legions, the Iron Warriors with their bitter siege mentality, the Night Lords with their culture of terror, made decisions that, while morally abhorrent, were at least comprehensible. The Alpha Legion did something far stranger. They may have sided with the traitors to save humanity. They may have remained loyal to the Emperor, even as they fought beneath Horus's banner. They may have been pursuing an agenda so labyrinthine that neither loyalist nor traitor truly understood what was happening. Or they may simply have been the most accomplished liars in a galaxy already drowning in deception. The answer depends entirely on which account you trust, and the Alpha Legion has made absolutely certain that no account can be trusted completely. So let us begin at the beginning. Or at least, let us begin at one of the several possible beginnings, because even the origin of the 20th Legion is shrouded in deliberate mystery. Let us talk about how a ghost became a legend, how a shadow became a legion, and how two brothers, who might have been one soul split between two bodies, set in motion a chain of events whose consequences are still reverberating through the 42nd millennium. This is the story of the Hydra. And like the mythical beast from which they take their name, cut off one head and two more shall take its place. Part 1. Born in Shadow, the Ghost Legion and the Trefoil. Long before the name Alpha Legion was ever spoken aloud, long before the Primarch called Alpharius revealed himself to the galaxy, the 20th Legion existed in a form so secret that most of the Imperium had no idea it was there. To understand how extraordinary this is, you need to appreciate the context in which the Space Marine Legions were created. The Emperor of Mankind, that towering golden figure whose ambition stretched across the stars and whose genius reshaped the very destiny of the human species, created 20 legions of genetically enhanced super soldiers to serve as the spearhead of his great crusade. Each legion was built around the genetic template of one of 20 primarchs, demigod generals designed to be the ultimate expressions of human potential. The creation of these legions was one of the most significant undertakings in human history, a process that consumed vast resources and required the coordination of thousands of the Imperium's finest minds. Most of these legions followed a recognizable pattern. They were created, they were equipped, they were tested in battle, and they were eventually reunited with the Primarch whose gene seed had given them life. The process was well documented, at least in broad strokes, by the remembrancers and logisticians who kept the records of the Great Crusade. We know, for instance, that the Lunar Wolves were among the first to take to the battlefield. We know that the Ultramarines grew to become the largest of all the legions. We know that the Dark Angels carried with them secrets from Terra's own age of strife. But when it comes to the 20th Legion, the records become strange, contradictory, full of gaps and whispers, and half-formed references that never quite resolve into a complete picture. The Imperialis Logistica, the vast bureaucratic apparatus that tracked every aspect of the Imperium's military strength, could not confirm even the most basic details about the 20th with any certainty. Not their preliminary recruitment worlds, not their livery, not even an accurate count of their operating strength. It was as if an entire legion of Space Marines, tens of thousands of transhuman warriors equipped with the most advanced weapons humanity had ever produced, had simply appeared from nowhere, fully formed and ready for war. This was, of course, exactly what the Emperor intended. The 20th Legion was part of a group that certain highly classified sources refer to as the Trefoil. This was a designation given to 3 specific legions, the 20th, the 6th, which would become the Space Wolves, and the 18th, which would become the Salamanders, that were created and maintained in deliberate separation from the rest of the Legiones Astartes. The reasons for this separation have never been fully explained, though it is clear that the Emperor had specific and highly sensitive purposes in mind for each of these 3 forces. What sets the 20th apart, even among this already secretive grouping, is the sheer depth of the secrecy that surrounded it. The Space Wolves and Salamanders, while created in isolation, eventually emerged into public view and took their place alongside their brother legions. The 20th remained hidden for far longer, its existence known only to the Emperor, to Malcador the Sigillite, his closest advisor, and perhaps to a handful of other individuals whose identities have been lost to time. The gene seed used to create the 20th was the last strain developed for the Legiones Astartes, crafted at the very end of the Unification Wars that saw the Emperor consolidate his rule over Terra. Information about this gene seed was classified at the highest levels, its origins and specific properties a mystery even to the other gene wrights who had helped create the templates for the remaining legions. Whatever the Emperor designed the 20th to be, And he took exceptional care to ensure that no one else would understand the full scope of his intentions. The earliest known activities of the force that would become the Alpha Legion are reconstructed not from direct records, which do not exist, but from the gaps in other records. Imperial scholars have identified a pattern of anomalous events stretching across the early decades of the Great Crusade, incidents that do not fit neatly into the documented activities of any recognized legion. Small-scale operations conducted far from the front lines, squad-sized or company-sized units appearing in places where no legion had been deployed, carrying out missions that ranged from targeted assassinations to the recovery of unspecified artifacts to the abduction of key individuals from anti-imperial groups. But the warriors who carried out these operations were unmistakably Space Marines. Their size, their capabilities, their war gear, all of it pointed to the legionnaires Astartes. But they carried no heraldry, they left no identifying marks, and they operated under clearance codes designated Alpha, codes that overrode the authority of virtually every other military and civilian institution in the Imperium. This is where the designation Alpha Legion likely originated, not as a formal legion title, but as a shorthand used by bewildered imperial officials who encountered these mysterious warriors and had no other way to categorize them. The warriors themselves offered no clarification. They completed their missions with ruthless efficiency, and they made it an absolute policy to never leave any witnesses to their activities. The rumors spread anyway. You cannot deploy superhuman soldiers across the breadth of a galactic crusade without someone noticing, no matter how careful you are. Whispers began to circulate among the remembrancers and military commanders who served alongside the recognized legions. Whispers of a ghost legion that operated in the spaces between the documented campaigns. A force that seemed to bleed enemy resistance through black operations and subterfuge long before the formal military forces arrived to deliver the killing blow. These whispers described a pattern of warfare that would later become the Alpha Legion's signature. First, the target would be softened through covert means. Key leaders assassinated, supply lines disrupted, communications networks compromised, whole populations turned against their own governments through carefully orchestrated propaganda and manufactured crises. Then, when the enemy was sufficiently weakened and confused, the killing blow would come from 100 directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault so devastating and so precisely targeted that resistance would collapse almost before it had begun. The Alpha Legion would later codify this approach under the name the Harrowing, and it would become the defining tactical doctrine of the 20th Legion. But in these early days, before the Legion had been formally revealed, the Harrowing existed in prototype form, a method of warfare being tested and refined in the shadows, while the rest of the Imperium fought its wars in the light. It is worth pausing here to consider what this tells us about the Emperor's intentions for the 20th Legion. Every legion was designed with a specific role in mind. The Imperial Fists were built to be the ultimate defenders, the masters of fortification and siege warfare. The White Scars were designed for speed and mobility, lightning raids and rapid redeployments. The Word-Bearers were meant to carry the Emperor's secular truth to the conquered populations of the galaxy, though that role would later be perverted beyond recognition. The 20th was designed for something different, something that existed in the margins of conventional warfare, in the spaces that the other legions either could not or would not occupy. They were built for intelligence gathering, for sabotage, for assassination, all for the kind of warfare that happens before the first bolt is fired and after the last body has been cleared from the field. They were, in essence, the Emperor's own intelligence agency, his personal instrument for the kind of work that could never appear in official records. This understanding is crucial for everything that follows, because it means that from the very moment of their creation, the 20th Legion existed in a fundamentally different relationship to truth and transparency than any of their brother legions. Secrecy was not a policy choice for the Alpha Legion. It was their founding purpose. It was woven into their gene seed, impressed upon their culture, and reinforced by every mission they undertook. when critics later accused the Alpha Legion of being needlessly secretive or pathologically addicted to deception. Yes, they were, in a very real sense, criticizing the Legion for being exactly what the Emperor made them to be. The question, of course, is whether the Emperor fully understood what he was creating, whether he foresaw that a Legion built on secrecy and deception would eventually turn those tools against the Imperium itself, or whether he believed, perhaps naively for a being of such transcendent intelligence, that a weapon designed to operate in shadow would always remain pointed in the direction he chose. That question, like so many questions surrounding the Alpha Legion, has no definitive answer. What we do know is that the Ghost Legion continued to operate in the margins of the Great Crusade for decades, its existence acknowledged by the Emperor and by Malcador, but hidden from the vast majority of the Imperium's leadership. During this time, the Legion developed its core techniques, its networks of human operatives, its methods of infiltration and information warfare. It built the infrastructure that would later allow it to operate across the galaxy with a coordination and precision that baffled even the most experienced military commanders. And then, just as the Great Crusade was reaching its zenith, the Ghost Legion's Primarch was found. Or rather, the Ghost Legion's Primarch chose to reveal himself, which is a very different thing, because with the Alpha Legion, nothing, absolutely nothing, is ever as simple as it appears. Part 2. One Soul, Two Bodies, Alpharius and Omegon. Of all the Primarchs, those 20, well, technically 21, demigod sons of the Emperor who were scattered across the galaxy by the machinations of the Chaos Gods, yet the Primarch of the Alpha Legion is simultaneously the least known and the most discussed. This is because the Primarch of the Alpha Legion is not one being, he is two. And the story of how these twin brothers found each other and what they became when they were reunited is one of the most fascinating origin stories in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. But first, a caveat. Because the Alpha Legion's Primarch is who he is, which is to say, a being whose entire existence is built around deception and misdirection. There are multiple origin stories, and they contradict each other in fundamental ways. This is not an accident. This is not sloppy record-keeping. This is deliberate, a feature of the Alpha Legion's approach to information warfare applied to their own history. I am going to present the major accounts as clearly as I can. But you should understand going in that any or all of these stories might be elaborate fabrications. Let us start with what is generally accepted as the official account, the one that appeared in Imperial records before the Horus heresy tore the galaxy apart. According to this version of events, the Primarch known as Alpharius was the last of the Emperor's sons to be found. This is the origin of many of the informal names associated with the Legion. The last, the final configuration. The discovery supposedly happened late in the Great Crusade, when a Lunar Wolves battleship encountered a ragtag fleet of small, primitive human vessels operating in a remote sector of the galaxy. These vessels, despite their inferior technology, had been conducting a remarkably effective guerrilla campaign against various alien threats in the region, and they were led by a figure of such extraordinary tactical brilliance that the Lunar Wolves captain immediately recognized him as something more than human. Horus himself, the first found Primarch and the Emperor's most beloved son, came to meet this mysterious commander. What followed was a remarkable encounter. The stranger used his primitive fleet to cleverly maneuver the Lunar Wolves' advance ship into a precarious tactical position, demonstrating a level of strategic thinking that rivaled Horus's own. When the stranger finally boarded the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship, he fought his way through the corridors, killing or incapacitating several Lunar Wolves marines before Horus himself intervened. But Horus did not strike down the intruder. Instead, he recognized the newcomer for what he was, a brother, a Primarch. At the last of the Emperor's scattered sons, returned at last to the fold of the Imperium. The newcomer identified himself as Alpharius, and he claimed to have been traveling through this region of space for many years. However, he refused to identify his homeworld and various planets in the region that were subsequently brought into Imperial compliance all denied being the place where Alfarius had grown up. This is the story that most of the Imperium accepted. It is clean, it is dramatic, and it fits neatly into the established pattern of Primarch discoveries. There is just one problem with it. According to Alfarius himself, it is a complete and deliberate lie. In an account that surfaced through the novel Alfarius, Head of the Hydra, the Primarch tells a very different story of his origins, one that turns the accepted narrative entirely on its head. According to this version, Alfarius was not the last Primarch to be found. He was the first. In this telling, when the Chaos Gods scattered the Primarchs across the galaxy, Alfarius alone was not sent far from Terra. He landed on the homeworld of humanity itself, or very close to it, and was recovered by the Emperor almost immediately after the scattering. But rather than reveal his first found son to the galaxy, the Emperor chose to keep Alfarius's existence secret. While Horus was paraded before the Imperium as the inaugural Primarch, the favored son, the Golden Boy, Alfarius, was hidden away and placed under the tutelage of Malcador the Sigillite. Under Malcador's guidance, Alfarius learned the arts of secrecy, manipulation, and covert warfare. Yet he was taught to disguise himself, to think in layers of deception, to see every situation from multiple angles simultaneously. He was, in effect, trained as the Emperor's own spy master, a role that would later define the entire culture of the Alpha Legion. During this period, Alfarius reportedly disguised himself as an ordinary space marine, or at least as ordinary as a being of his stature could manage, and participated in many of the early Great Crusade's most significant events, without anyone realizing that a Primarch was walking among them. This is easier for Alfarius than it would have been for most of his brothers, because unlike Primarchs such as Magnus the Red or Sanguinius, whose physical appearances were unmistakably superhuman, Alfarius was notably close to the size of a standard Astartes. Not quite as tall, but not quite as broad as many of his brothers, but still unmistakably transhuman. This relatively modest stature, by Primarch standards, became one of the Alpha Legion's greatest assets. But here is where the story takes its most remarkable turn. Because Alfarius, the first found and secretly raised Primarch, eventually received information that led him to a dead world at the edge of known space, a planet haunted by the alien species known as the Sloth. The Sloth are among the most nightmarish species in the Warhammer 40,000 setting, psychic parasites who feed on neural matter and are capable of feats of biological manipulation that make even the Dark Elder look restrained. On this world, Alfarius found something that should have been impossible. He found his twin, his name was Omegon, and he had been fighting the Sloth alone, trapped on this dead world, surviving through a combination of Primarch-level combat ability and the kind of desperate ingenuity that only comes from facing extinction on a daily basis. When the two brothers met, they recognized each other instantly. They were identical in every physical respect, two bodies that seemed to house a single shared consciousness, a phenomenon they would later describe as being one soul in two bodies. The existence of twin Primarchs was, as far as anyone knows, unique among the Emperor's creations. It is unknown whether the Emperor intended this when he designed the 20th Primarch's genetic template, or whether the embryo split into two identical fetuses during gestation, perhaps as a result of the Chaos God's interference during the scattering. What is known is that Alfarius and Omegon agreed, as upon their reunion, to keep the nature of their dual existence hidden from everyone, including, as far as they could manage, the Emperor himself. This decision was monumental, and it speaks volumes about the mindset of both brothers. Consider what they chose to do. They chose to maintain one of the most significant secrets in the history of the Imperium, the existence of a 21st Primarch, not because they were ordered to, but because they decided it was strategically advantageous. From the very beginning, Alfarius and Omegon operated on the principle that information was power, and that the most powerful information was the kind that no one else possessed. With their shared identity established, the twin Primarchs took full advantage of their physical similarity. They swapped places constantly, as sometimes having Omegon appear in public as Alfarius, while the real Alfarius pursued other objectives entirely. There are documented instances where Alfarius appeared at gatherings of the Primarchs that the original Alfarius could not possibly have attended, and other instances where the Alpha Legion seemed to be operating under direct Primarch-level leadership in two different theaters of war simultaneously. This shell game extended beyond the Primarchs themselves. One of the most distinctive features of the Alpha Legion was the near-identical appearance of its members. Whether through deliberate genetic manipulation, careful selection of recruits, or some quirk of the 20th's gene seed, the warriors of the Alpha Legion bore a striking resemblance to each other and, critically, to their Primarch. This allowed individual legionaries to impersonate Alfarius with reasonable effectiveness, further confusing attempts to track the Primarch's movements and intentions. The phrase, "I am Alfarius," became something between a battle cry, a philosophical statement, and a security protocol. Every member of the Alpha Legion was trained to identify themselves as Alfarius when interacting with outsiders. This was not mere bravado or unit cohesion, though it served both purposes admirably. It was a deliberate tactical choice, designed to create an impenetrable fog of uncertainty around the Legion's command structure. If every warrior claimed to be Alfarius, then identifying the real Alfarius became essentially impossible. If the enemy could not identify the real Alfarius, they could not target him. If they could not target him, they could not disrupt the Legion's command and control. The implications of this approach went far beyond simple battlefield deception. The Alpha Legion's embrace of collective identity meant that the Legion could lose any individual member, even its Primarch, without suffering the kind of catastrophic leadership vacuum that might cripple another force. The Hydra truly had many heads. Cut off one, and the others would continue to function. This was not just a metaphor. It was a survival strategy embedded in the very DNA of the Legion's organizational structure. The relationship between Alfarius and Omegon was also unique among the Primarchs. Where other Primarchs operated as sole commanders of their legions, with varying degrees of consultation with their senior officers, Alfarius and Omegon functioned as genuine co-leaders. And they divided responsibilities, with Alfarius generally serving as the more public face of the Legion, while Omegon operated in the background, often leading the Efrit stealth squads, or commanding covert operations that the rest of the Imperium never knew about. But these roles were fluid, and the brothers switched them with the ease of two people sharing a single mind. There are hints that the twins' connection went beyond simple fraternal closeness. The Horus Heresy novel, Praetorian of Dawn, reveals that Alfarius and Omegon could imprint portions of their own memories onto their legionaries by having them drink Primarch blood. This ability, reminiscent of some of the more esoteric capabilities attributed to other Primarchs, suggests that the connection between the twins was genuinely psychic in nature, a shared consciousness that could be extended in limited fashion to their sons. But even between themselves, the twins were not always in perfect agreement. There are indications in the lore that Alfarius was somewhat more willing to accept civilian casualties as a cost of achieving strategic objectives, while Omegon was more cautious about the human toll of their operations. This divergence, subtle at first, would become critically important as the Horus Heresy approached and the twins faced the most consequential decision of their existence. Before that decision, however, there was the matter of proving themselves. Because the Alpha Legion, for all its secrecy and operational sophistication, still operated within the framework of the Great Crusade. And in the Great Crusade, legions proved their worth through conquest. Of the story of how the Alpha Legion made its mark on the galaxy and the enemies it made along the way is a story of brilliance, arrogance, and the seeds of a rivalry that would eventually help push the galaxy towards civil war. Part 3. The Art of the Hydra, Combat Doctrine, and the Tools of Shadow. To understand how the Alpha Legion fought, you have to first understand how they thought. Every Space Marine Legion developed a distinctive approach to warfare that reflected the personality of its primarch and the culture of its homeworld. The imperial fists built unbreakable fortresses and shattered those of their enemies. The World Eaters threw themselves into close combat with a fury that terrified even their allies. The Ultramarines perfected a flexible, adaptable doctrine that could be applied to virtually any tactical situation with predictable, efficient results. The Alpha Legion's approach was fundamentally different from all of these, and it was different in a way that made many of their brother legions deeply uncomfortable. Where other legions fought wars, the Alpha Legion orchestrated them. Where other legions sought to destroy the enemy's military capability, the Alpha Legion sought to destroy the enemy's capacity to resist before the fighting even began. Their wars were won in the planning phase, in the intelligence gathering, in the patient cultivation of agents, and the careful manipulation of information, long before the first bolter shell was fired. This approach had a name, one we have already touched upon, the harrowing. But the harrowing was not a single tactic, but a comprehensive method of warfare that proceeded in distinct phases, each designed to build upon the last. It began with intelligence gathering, the insertion of operatives, and the cultivation of informants within the target population. These operatives might be Alpha Legion legionaries surgically altered to pass as locals, or they might be native humans who had been recruited, bribed, blackmailed, or otherwise persuaded to serve the Legion's interests. The Alpha Legion referred to these human agents as operatives, and the use of non-Astartes specialists was one of the Legion's most distinctive and controversial practices. Other legions used human auxiliaries, of course. The Imperial Army fought alongside the Space Marines throughout the Great Crusade, and many legions developed close working relationships with specific army regiments. But the Alpha Legion's use of human operatives went far beyond conventional military cooperation. These were not soldiers serving alongside Space Marines. They were intelligence assets embedded deep within enemy territories, sometimes years or even decades before the Alpha Legion planned to strike. They were provocateurs who could destabilize entire governments with a well-placed rumor or a carefully timed assassination. They were saboteurs who could cripple a planet's infrastructure overnight, leaving the population vulnerable and confused when the main assault finally came. The operatives were marked with a small Hydra tattoo, the symbol of the Alpha Legion, and they remained loyal to the Legion through a combination of indoctrination, personal loyalty, and in some cases, a genuine belief that they were serving the greater good of humanity. The Alpha Legion went to extraordinary lengths to protect these assets, sometimes expending significant military resources to extract a single compromised operative rather than abandoning them. This was not mere sentimentality. A well-placed operative represented years of investment, and the Alpha Legion was nothing if not pragmatic about the value of its resources. Once the intelligence network was in place and the preliminary destabilization had begun, the harrowing moved to its second phase, direct action by small, elite Alpha Legion units. This is where the Headhunter kill teams and the Efrit stealth squads came into their own. The Headhunters were the Alpha Legion's premier assassination and covert action units. The histories of the Great Crusade record that it was actually the Alpha Legion that first conceived of the deployment of what became known as Seeker Squads, specialized units of Space Marines equipped to identify and eliminate high-value targets on the battlefield. This concept proved so effective that it was eventually adopted by other legions throughout the Great Crusade. But the Alpha Legion did not stop with the basic Seeker concept. They refined and enhanced it, creating the Headhunter kill teams as a further evolution of the principle. Headhunters were supremely skilled infiltrators who specialized in creating conditions of absolute chaos among the enemy's ranks. They eliminated key officers, struck critical positions, and sabotaged strategic assets, all while operating behind enemy lines with minimal support. They were equipped with some of the most advanced war gear the Alpha Legion could provide, including combi bolters, loaded with specialized Banestrike ammunition, rounds designed specifically to penetrate power armor. They also carried disruption arrays called Hydra's Whales, sophisticated electronic warfare devices that could disable communications equipment and Auspex sensors, effectively blinding and deafening the enemy at the most critical moments. The Efrit stealth squads operated at an even deeper level of secrecy. Led, in many cases, by Omegon himself, the Efrit served as both covert action teams and personal bodyguards for the Primarchs. Where the Lernaean Terminators, the Alpha Legion's elite shock assault troops, served as the visible, attention-grabbing bodyguard force, the Efrit were the hidden dagger. The protectors you could not see. Their existence was so closely guarded that even within the Alpha Legion, not all members knew the full extent of their activities. The Lernaean Terminators themselves deserve special attention. Named after the mythological Lernaean Hydra, these warriors represented the Alpha Legion's capacity for direct, overwhelming violence. Clad in cataphracti pattern Terminator armor and armed with Volkite chargers and power axes, the Lernaeans were designed to do one thing: teleport directly into the heart of the enemy's most heavily defended positions and destroy everything of value before the defenders could react. Their role was psychological as much as tactical. The Lernaeans were deployed to eliminate the enemy's most powerful frontline units and most valuable battlefield assets in such an emphatic and bloody manner that the shock of their attack would cascade through the entire enemy force. They were the sledgehammer that fell after the scalpel had done its work, the brutal exclamation point at the end of a sentence that had been carefully composed over weeks or months of covert preparation. Few people outside the Alpha Legion knew of the Lernaean Terminator squads, and this was not because the Legion sought to obscure their existence. It was because the Lernaeans rarely left any witnesses to their deeds. They arrived without warning, they destroyed their objectives with terrifying efficiency, and they departed before the enemy could mount an effective response. And in the rare cases where survivors did exist, their accounts were often so traumatic and fragmented that they were dismissed as unreliable. The final phase of the harrowing was the assault itself, the moment when the full weight of the Alpha Legion fell upon an enemy that had been systematically blinded, weakened, and demoralized over the preceding weeks or months. This assault came from 100 directions simultaneously, a coordinated strike of such complexity and precision that the enemy was overwhelmed before they could form a coherent defensive response. Every weakness that had been identified during the intelligence gathering phase was exploited. Every asset that had been neutralized by the headhunters and Efrit was a gap in the enemy's defenses that the Legion's line troops poured through. The beauty of the harrowing, as from the Alpha Legion's perspective, was its efficiency. By the time the final assault was launched, the outcome was essentially predetermined. The enemy had been reduced to a state where effective resistance was impossible, and the Legion's casualties during the assault phase were typically minimal. The Alpha Legion did not believe in fair fights. They believed in winning, and they believed that the most effective victory was one achieved with the minimum expenditure of their own warriors' lives.
Now, before we continue, I just want to take a quick second to share my personal take on this. The Cabal storyline is, in my opinion, one of the absolute best writing to come out of the entire Horus Heresy series. Dan Abnett really cooked with that one. The idea that the Alpha Legion didn't fall to chaos out of weakness or ambition, but out of a genuinely agonizing moral dilemma, that hits different. It makes them so much more interesting than just another traitor legion with a grudge. Every time I reread the part of the lore, I find myself going back and forth on whether they made the right call, and honestly, I still don't have an answer. That's the mark of a great storytelling there. Anyway, that was just my take. Let's get back to the video.
This philosophy extended to the Legion's internal culture in ways that were unusual among the Space Marine legions. Unlike many legions, where individual heroism was celebrated and warriors competed for personal glory, the Alpha Legion valued the collective over the individual. Initiation trials were conducted for squads, not individuals. You either succeeded as a group or you failed as a group. Foolhardy individual heroics were not just frowned upon. They were considered a liability, a failure to subordinate personal ambition to the needs of the mission. Decisions within the Legion were made in a surprisingly open and democratic manner. All ranks, including the Legion's non-Astartes operatives, were allowed to interject and comment freely during planning sessions. This freedom extended beyond military matters to questions of philosophy, and galactic policy that would have been forbidden or silenced in other imperial institutions. The Alpha Legion was, in many ways, the most egalitarian of the Space Marine legions, a fact that sits somewhat uncomfortably alongside their reputation for manipulation and deception. But there was a darker side to this collective identity. That the Alpha Legion's emphasis on unity and interchangeability could be dehumanizing in its own way. Individual warriors were not celebrated. Personal achievements were subsumed into the collective narrative of the Legion. And the relentless focus on operational security meant that even within the Legion, information was compartmentalized to an extraordinary degree. A given legionary might participate in an operation without understanding its true objectives, carrying out his assigned role with perfect precision while remaining ignorant of the larger plan of which he was a part. This compartmentalization would become increasingly significant as the heresy approached, because if individual legionaries did not always know the true purpose of their missions, as it follows that some of them might have been fighting for objectives they would not have chosen had they understood the full picture. The Alpha Legion's culture of secrecy, which had served them so brilliantly as a military doctrine, also created the conditions for a kind of institutional betrayal that went beyond the choices of any single commander, even a Primarch. But that darkness lay in the future. During the Great Crusade, the Alpha Legion's methods produced results that were, by any objective measure, extraordinary. World after world fell to the 20th Legion's approach, often with casualty rates so low on both sides that other legions initially dismissed the Alpha Legion's victories as somehow less worthy than those achieved through more conventional means. This dismissal would prove to be a critical mistake, one that planted the seeds of a rivalry that would have consequences reaching far beyond the personal egos of the Primarchs involved. There is another dimension to the Alpha Legion's combat doctrine that deserves attention, and that is their approach to information itself. In a galaxy where most military forces treated intelligence as a supporting function, something that informed decisions but was ultimately subordinate to the application of force, the Alpha Legion treated information as the primary weapon and force as secondary. This was a radical inversion of conventional military thinking, and it had profound implications for how the Legion organized itself and how it related to the rest of the Imperium. Every member of the Alpha Legion was trained in the arts of intelligence gathering and analysis. Not just the specialist operatives, but not just the headhunters and Efrit, but every single legionary. A line trooper in the Alpha Legion was expected to be capable of operating independently behind enemy lines, gathering information, recruiting local assets, and conducting sabotage operations with minimal support and no direct oversight. This was a level of individual capability that far exceeded what was expected of warriors in other legions, where the emphasis was typically on functioning within a rigid command hierarchy. The Legion's communication protocols reflected this intelligence-first approach. Alpha Legion forces used an extraordinarily complex system of codes, countersigns, and dead drops that changed constantly and varied between individual cells. Even intercepted communications were useless to the enemy, and because the encryption was layered so deeply that breaking one code would only reveal another layer of encoded information beneath it. This obsession with secure communications extended to the Legion's internal structure. Information within the Alpha Legion was compartmentalized with a ruthlessness that would have been considered paranoid in any other organization. Individual cells knew only what they needed to know for their specific mission. The connections between cells were maintained through cutouts and intermediaries, so that the compromise of one cell would not cascade into the compromise of the entire network. The result was an organization of extraordinary resilience. You could capture an Alpha Legion operative, subject him to the most sophisticated interrogation techniques available to the Imperium, and extract every piece of information he possessed, and you would still know almost nothing about the larger organization he served. The knowledge simply was not there to be extracted. It existed only in the aggregate, in the collective intelligence of the network as a whole, and that aggregate was accessible only through the network's communication protocols, which would automatically be changed the moment a compromise was detected. This approach to information security had a philosophical dimension as well. The Alpha Legion believed, on a fundamental level, that knowledge was the most dangerous substance in the galaxy. More dangerous than virus bombs, more dangerous than warp sorcery, more dangerous than the terrifying weaponry of the Mechanicum. Because knowledge, properly applied, could render all of those things irrelevant. And the Legion's approach to warfare also had a significant impact on how they recruited and trained their human operatives. Unlike other legions, which maintained a clear and absolute distinction between Astartes and the mortal humans who served alongside them, the Alpha Legion blurred this boundary in ways that made other Imperial authorities deeply uncomfortable. Human operatives in the Alpha Legion were not simply auxiliaries or support staff. They were integral components of the Legion's military capability, valued for skills and knowledge that even a space marine could not replicate. A local merchant who knew the back alleys of a hive city, a planetary administrator who had access to classified defense plans, a communications technician who could tap into encrypted military networks. These individuals were recruited, trained, and deployed with the same level of care and strategic planning that the Legion applied to its Astartes operations. The Alpha Legion marked its human operatives with a small Hydra tattoo, similar to the Legion's own insignia, creating a sense of belonging and identity that crossed the seemingly impassable boundary between transhuman and mortal. These operatives were not discarded after their usefulness was exhausted. The Alpha Legion went to extraordinary lengths to protect its human assets, sometimes diverting significant military resources to extract a compromised operative or eliminate anyone who threatened to expose their identity. This protectiveness was pragmatic rather than sentimental. A well-placed operative represented years of careful cultivation, and the Alpha Legion understood that the trust and loyalty of their human agents were among their most valuable strategic assets. But there was also something more to it, a recognition that the war the Alpha Legion was fighting could not be won by superhuman warriors alone. It required the participation of ordinary humans, people who could go where Space Marines could not, who could access networks that were closed to transhuman outsiders, who could blend into the fabric of civilian society in a way that no Astartes, no matter how skilled, could ever hope to match. The relationship between the Alpha Legion and its operatives also extended to the recruitment of specialists from other Imperial military organizations. Members of the Imperial Army, the Mechanicum, the Administratum. Virtually any human with useful skills or knowledge could be approached by the Alpha Legion and offered a place in its network. These recruits often remained in their original positions, serving as deep cover agents who would respond to Alpha Legion commands when the need arose. They were sleeper cells, ordinary citizens leading ordinary lives, who could be activated at a moment's notice to carry out extraordinary acts of sabotage, espionage, or assassination. The ethical implications of this approach were profound and deeply troubling. By recruiting agents from within Imperial organizations, the Alpha Legion was, in effect, subverting the very institutions it was supposed to serve. It was turning loyal Imperial citizens into unwitting tools of a force that answered to no authority but its own Primarch. This was the Alpha Legion's great paradox. In pursuing what it believed was the most effective way to serve the Emperor's interests, it was systematically undermining the Emperor's institutions. The physical appearance of the Alpha Legion's warriors also tied directly into their tactical philosophy. The warriors of the Alpha Legion bore a striking resemblance to each other. This physical similarity was far more pronounced than in other legions, where individual variation in height, build, and features was common despite the homogenizing effect of the gene seed implantation process. In the Alpha Legion, this variation was minimal. Warriors looked alike to a degree that was genuinely unsettling to outsiders. Their faces shared the same broad planes and angular features. Their builds were remarkably uniform. Even their voices tended toward a similar register and cadence. This physical uniformity was almost certainly the result of careful genetic selection during the recruitment process, with the Legion favoring aspirants whose natural features most closely matched the appearance of the Primarch. and his existing warriors. The practical benefits of this uniformity were enormous. When every warrior looked like every other warrior, and when they all looked like a slightly smaller version of the Primarch himself, the concept of disguise and impersonation became trivially easy. Any legionary could claim to be any other legionary, or even the Primarch, with a reasonable expectation of being believed. Enemy commanders who thought they had identified and eliminated an Alpha Legion leader would discover, often fatally, that the leader they had killed was an ordinary legionary, wearing the same face and speaking with the same voice. The real commander was elsewhere, directing the next phase of the operation, while the enemy celebrated a victory that had never actually occurred. This kind of tactical deception, repeated across hundreds of engagements, created a reputation for unkillability that was, in some ways, more valuable than actual unkillability. The Alpha Legion's armor and heraldry were similarly designed to maximize ambiguity. Their color scheme, a distinctive metallic blue-green that seemed to shift and change depending on the light, was itself a form of camouflage, not the kind that hides you from sight, but the kind that makes you difficult to identify or categorize. Their reports of Alpha Legion sightings frequently disagreed on the color of the observed warrior's armor, with descriptions ranging from deep indigo to brilliant turquoise to shimmering silver green. This inconsistency was not accidental. It was the result of specialized pigments in the armor's coating that reflected different wavelengths of light under different conditions, creating a visual uncertainty that perfectly complemented the Legion's broader strategy of ambiguity and misdirection. The many informal names given to the 20th Legion further illustrate this culture of layered identity. They were called the Harrowing, after their signature tactic. They were called the Children of Eris, after the ancient Terran goddess of discord. They were called the Left Hand of Darkness, a name that evoked their role as the Emperor's covert instrument. They were called the Azure Serpent for their shimmering armor and serpentine tactics. They were called Aleph Null, a mathematical reference to infinite sets that spoke to their seemingly boundless capacity for deception. And they were called, simply and terrifyingly, Legion, a word that in ancient Terran scripture meant a multitude beyond counting. Each of these names captured a different aspect of the Alpha Legion's character, and the fact that they embraced so many identities simultaneously said something profound about their relationship to the concept of identity itself. For the Alpha Legion, identity was not a fixed point. It was a tool, a weapon, a mask to be worn and discarded as circumstances demanded. This fluidity of identity extended from the individual warrior all the way up to the Legion as a whole, which could present a different face to every observer and a different narrative to every inquirer. Now, armed with this understanding of how the Alpha Legion thought and fought, let us examine how these principles were applied in practice during the greatest military campaign in human history. Part 4. The Great Crusade, Proving Grounds and the Seeds of Rivalry. The Alpha Legion's formal entry into the Great Crusade came later than that of most other legions, a consequence of their Primarch's late, or supposedly late, revelation. But once they took the field under Alpharius's open command, they wasted no time establishing themselves as a force to be reckoned with. Their tally of victories mounted with remarkable speed, and their methods, while controversial, produced results that could not be easily dismissed. The campaign that best exemplifies both the brilliance and the controversy of the Alpha Legion's approach is the conquest of Testra Prime. This was a non-compliant world, a human colony that had refused to accept the authority of the Imperium and the rule of the Emperor. Such worlds were common during the Great Crusade. The Imperium's standard response was to offer the carrot of peaceful integration, and when that was refused, to apply the stick of military force until compliance was achieved. The Alpha Legion's approach to Testra Prime was something else entirely. Rather than launching a conventional military campaign, Alpharius orchestrated a masterful operation in which every possible ruse and stratagem was utilized. Our intelligence operatives were inserted months before the main force arrived. Key military and political figures were compromised through blackmail, bribery, or simple assassination. Communication networks were infiltrated and used to spread disinformation that turned different factions of the planetary government against each other. Supply chains were disrupted in ways that looked like accidents or corruption rather than enemy action. By the time the Alpha Legion's military forces actually arrived in the Testra system, the planet's defensive capability had been reduced to a fraction of its potential. The final military campaign was almost an afterthought, a devastating and precisely coordinated strike that shattered what remained of organized resistance before the defenders had even realized that they were under attack. An estimated enemy casualties were in the range of 90%, inflicted not through the kind of prolonged, bloody attrition that characterized many Imperial compliance actions, but through a campaign of systematic destabilization that had made effective resistance impossible. It was a triumph of planning and execution, a textbook demonstration of the Alpha Legion's philosophy that the best war is one that is won before it is fought, and it provoked one of the most significant inter-legion confrontations of the entire Great Crusade. Robuta Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines and one of the most respected military commanders in the Imperium, looked at the conquest of Testra Prime and declared it a grand waste of time and resources. The world could have been taken far more quickly by conventional means, Guilliman argued, and the elaborate scheme of infiltration and subversion that Alfarius had employed was an unnecessary complication that served no strategic purpose beyond demonstrating the Alpha Legion's cleverness. The confrontation between Alfarius and Guilliman was volcanic. Here were two Primarchs with fundamentally incompatible philosophies of warfare. Guilliman believed in efficiency, in standardized doctrine, in the kind of systematic, replicable approach to conquest that had made the Ultramarines the largest and most successful of all the legions. His methods were proven, his results were consistent, and his codex of strategic principles was becoming the foundation upon which the entire Imperium's military doctrine would eventually be built. Alfarius believed in something different. He believed that every situation was unique, that flexibility and adaptability were more valuable than rigid doctrine, and that the most important battles were the ones that took place in the shadows, in the minds of the enemy, in the information networks that connected a civilization's power centers. He saw Guilliman's approach as crude and unimaginative, a brute force solution to problems that demanded subtlety and finesse. The argument between them grew heated. Guilliman, who was not accustomed to having his methods questioned, pointed to his own legion's record, a record of victories that dwarfed what the Alpha Legion had achieved in its comparatively short active history. This was a blow that struck home, because it was undeniably true. The Ultramarines had been fighting the Great Crusade for nearly 2 centuries longer than the Alpha Legion, and their list of conquered worlds was staggering. But Alfarius was not the kind of Primarch who accepted a rebuke quietly. The two parted on acrimonious terms, with Alfarius believing, perhaps correctly, that Guilliman hated him. More importantly, Alfarius resolved to push his legion even further, to prove beyond any possible doubt that his methods were not just viable, but superior to the conventional approaches favored by his brothers. This determination would drive the Alpha Legion to ever more elaborate and audacious operations, each one designed to demonstrate the superiority of their approach. And with each success, the resentment from certain quarters of the Imperium's leadership grew deeper. Guilliman was not the only Primarch who clashed with Alfarius. Rogel Dawn, the master builder and Praetorian of Terror, was perhaps even more critical of the Alpha Legion's methods. During a joint campaign known as the World Prince Campaign, Dawn confronted Alfarius directly and accused him of fighting through deception, not because it was necessary for victory, but because it gratified his own ego. Alfarius did not fight sneakily because sneaking was the only path to success, Dawn argued. He fought sneakily because he enjoyed proving that he was cleverer than everyone else. This accusation cut deep because there was an uncomfortable grain of truth in it. The Alpha Legion's culture of secrecy and superiority sometimes veered into what could only be described as showing off. They did not just want to win, they wanted to win in the most elaborate, most unexpected, most psychologically devastating way possible, and they wanted everyone to know eventually that they had been outmaneuvered from the start. There was a performative quality to their deceptions, a need to demonstrate their intellectual superiority that went beyond mere tactical necessity. But the criticism also missed something essential about the Alpha Legion's purpose. Their methods were not just about winning individual battles. They were about building a capability, an infrastructure of intelligence and influence that would allow the Imperium to project power in ways that went beyond the simple application of military force. The operatives that the Alpha Legion planted on conquered worlds did not just disappear after the fighting was over. They remained in place, forming a galaxy-spanning intelligence network that could detect and neutralize threats before they became large enough to require a full military response. Well, in this sense, the Alpha Legion was not just fighting the current war. It was preparing for all the wars that would come after. It was building the kind of deep, persistent intelligence capability that a galactic empire would need if it hoped to maintain control over millions of worlds across hundreds of thousands of light years. Whether the other Primarchs understood this or not, the effect of their criticism was to isolate Alfarius and the Alpha Legion from the broader community of legions. Among all the Primarchs, only one consistently praised the Alpha Legion's methods and appreciated the sophistication of their approach. That Primarch was Horus Lupercal, the War Master, the first found son, the one who would eventually lead half the Imperium into civil war. Horus's appreciation for the Alpha Legion was genuine. As the War Master and the supreme military commander of the Great Crusade, Horus had a broader strategic perspective than most of his brothers. He understood the value of intelligence, of covert operations, of the kind of unconventional warfare that the Alpha Legion excelled at. He was also, by temperament, more open-minded and less judgmental than Primarchs like Guilliman or Dawn, who tended to view any approach that deviated from their own preferred methods with suspicion. The relationship between Horus and Alfarius is often cited as one of the factors that led the Alpha Legion to side with the War Master during the heresy. And there is certainly truth in that. When the only brother who respects your methods is the one asking for your loyalty, the decision to follow him is, at minimum, understandable. But to attribute the Alpha Legion's turn to simple fraternal loyalty would be to dramatically underestimate both the complexity of their reasoning and the extraordinary external influence that was brought to bear upon them in the years before the heresy began. Because before Horus called, someone else came calling first. An organization older than humanity itself, with knowledge that extended across millennia and visions of the future that would shake the foundations of the Imperium. They called themselves the Cabal, and what they offered Alfarius and Omegon was nothing less than a glimpse of the end of everything. Part 5. The Cabal and the Impossible Choice. Approximately 2 standard years before the outbreak of the Horus heresy, while the Alpha Legion was conducting a war of imperial compliance on the planet of Nurth, and something unprecedented happened. The twin Primarchs were contacted by an organization that should not have existed. The Cabal was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable entities in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. It was a secret organization dedicated to the eradication of chaos, the great cosmic evil that lurked in the immaterial dimension known as the Warp. Its operatives were drawn from more than 1,000 different intelligent alien species, including the Aeldari, and fascinatingly, humanity itself. The Cabal claimed to have battled the forces of what they called the Primordial Annihilator, their name for chaos, for a span of time longer than the existence of mankind as a thinking species. The Cabal was not a military force in any conventional sense. It was a think tank, a strategic advisory body, as a collection of minds from across the galaxy's diverse intelligent species united by a single purpose: the destruction of chaos. Their principal capability was an enhanced form of far-seeing they called the Acuity, a predictive tool of such extraordinary sophistication that it could project possible futures across thousands of years with a degree of accuracy that bordered on the prophetic. The Cabal had been watching humanity for a very long time. They had studied the development of the Emperor's Primarchs with particular interest, and their analysis had led them to a startling conclusion. Of all the Primarchs, the most important in determining the ultimate fate of the galaxy were the oldest, meaning Horus, and the youngest, meaning Alpharius Omegon. What Horus would do, the Cabal claimed, Alpharius would undo. And the Alpha Legion was perfectly positioned to control and direct the coming crisis to one of two possible outcomes. The contact was arranged through a man named John Grammaticus, one of the most intriguing human characters in the Horus Heresy novels. Grammaticus was a perpetual, a human gifted with functional immortality, who had served the Cabal for over 1,000 years. He was also a powerful psyker, and his unique combination of longevity, psychic ability, and experience made him the ideal intermediary between the alien Cabal and the suspicious, secretive Primarchs of the Alpha Legion. The meeting between the Cabal and Alpharius Omegon took place on the planet Aeolith, and it was one of the most significant events in the history of the Horus Heresy, because it was at this meeting that the Cabal revealed, but with all the persuasive force of their millennia of accumulated wisdom and their terrifyingly detailed predictive models, the two possible futures that awaited humanity and the galaxy. The first future, the one that the Cabal claimed would result from a loyalist victory in the coming heresy, was deeply disturbing. In this timeline, the Emperor would defeat Horus, but at a terrible cost. The Emperor would be mortally wounded and entombed upon a device called the Golden Throne, trapped in a state of living death that would prevent him from dying, but also prevent him from acting. The Imperium would survive, but it would stagnate. Without the Emperor's guiding vision, it would decay from within, slowly but inexorably succumbing to corruption, bureaucratic paralysis, and the constant erosion of everything that had made it great. This decay would continue for 10 to 20,000 years, during which the Chaos Gods would grow stronger and stronger, feeding on the suffering and despair of trillions of souls, until eventually the entire galaxy was consumed by the warp. The second future, the one that would result from a traitor victory, was even more horrifying in the short term, but offered a bizarre kind of hope. In this timeline, Horus would defeat the Emperor and claim the throne of humanity, but the act of killing his own father would leave a permanent scar on Horus's soul, a sliver of conscience and self-loathing that the Chaos Gods could not fully extinguish. This guilt would eat at Horus, driving him to increasingly erratic and self-destructive behavior. Within 2 to 3 generations, the Imperium under Horus would tear itself apart, and the resulting conflagration would consume not just humanity, but the Chaos Gods themselves, who had become dependent on human souls as their primary source of sustenance. Humanity would be destroyed, but chaos would die with it, and the rest of the galaxy would be freed from the threat of the primordial annihilator forever. This was the choice that the Cabal presented to Alpharius and Omegon. Support the Emperor and guarantee 20,000 years of slow, agonizing decline, followed by universal annihilation. Or support Horus, sacrifice humanity in a final, terrible conflagration, and destroy chaos once and for all. Let that sink in for a moment. The Cabal was asking the Primarchs of the Alpha Legion to deliberately betray their father, their emperor, their species, not for personal gain, not for power or glory, but because they believed that humanity's destruction was the only way to save the galaxy from something even worse. They were asking the twins to make a sacrifice of such cosmic proportions that it defies easy moral categorization. Was it selfless to willingly destroy your own species for the greater good? Or was it the ultimate act of arrogance, to presume that you had the right to make that choice on behalf of trillions of souls who would never be consulted? The Primarch's response to this revelation is one of the most poignant moments in the entire Horus Heresy series. When the full implications of the Cabal's vision became clear, both Alpharius and Omegon staggered back and screamed, "The Alpha Legion has always been for the Emperor." That cry is telling. even in the face of this impossible choice. Whilst their first instinct was loyalty to their father and to the species he had created them to serve. They were not eager traitors. They were not ambitious power seekers. They were two beings confronted with what appeared to be an unsolvable paradox, a situation where every possible course of action led to catastrophe. In the end, the Primarchs chose to follow Horus. They did so not because they had been seduced by chaos, not because they resented the Emperor, not because they craved power, but because they believed, based on the Cabal's predictions, that supporting the War Master was the choice the Emperor himself would have made if presented with the same information. They chose to sacrifice everything: their loyalty, their honor, their relationship with their father and their brothers, just because they believed it was the only way to ultimately destroy the great enemy. But here is the critical detail that makes the Alpha Legion's story so much more complex than a simple tale of betrayal. There are strong indications that the twins did not fully accept the Cabal's narrative. According to Dan Abnett, the author who created the Cabal storyline in the Horus Heresy novel Legion, Alpharius and Omegon were not fooled by the Cabal at all. Their actions were contrary to the Cabal's intentions. They were, in effect, playing the Cabal just as they played everyone else, using the alien organization's resources and information while pursuing their own agenda that neither the Cabal nor the War Master fully understood. This interpretation is supported by the twins' subsequent behavior during the heresy, as which was wildly inconsistent with what a genuine traitor would have done. They sabotaged Horus's plans almost as often as they supported them. They allowed loyalist forces to escape traps that should have been fatal. They deliberately undermined their own side's operations at critical moments, and they never, at any point, showed any genuine devotion to the Chaos Gods themselves, treating the dark powers as tools to be used rather than entities to be worshipped. The Cabal itself eventually came to a bad end. The Aeldari Farseer Eldrad Ulthran, one of the most powerful and far-sighted beings in the galaxy, came to believe that the Cabal's approach was fundamentally flawed. He rejected their conclusion that humanity had to be destroyed to defeat chaos, and he saw a third possibility that the Cabal's acuity had missed: an alliance between the Imperium and the Aeldari that could halt the advance of chaos without requiring the extinction of either species. Acting on this belief, Eldrad recruited an unlikely ally, a word-bearer named Barthusa Narek, who despised the direction his own legion had taken, and together they eliminated the Cabal's leadership and most of its agents. The destruction of the Cabal removed whatever external guidance the Alpha Legion had been receiving, leaving the twins to navigate the heresy on their own. And navigate it they did, in a fashion so convoluted and contradictory that 10,000 years later, Imperial scholars are still debating what the Alpha Legion was actually trying to achieve. But before we can trace the Alpha Legion's path through the heresy, we need to talk about the event that turned the galaxy's Cold War into a blazing inferno. We need to talk about betrayal on a scale that even the Alpha Legion could not have fully anticipated. We need to talk about the Drop Site Massacre. Part 6. The Drop Site Massacre. Betrayal in the Black Sands. The massacre at Istvan V was the moment when the Horus Heresy stopped being a conspiracy and became a war. It was the largest betrayal in Imperial history, a carefully orchestrated trap that saw 8 traitor legions reveal their true colors in a single, devastating day of slaughter. And the Alpha Legion was there, in the second wave, their weapons pointed at brothers who had trusted them. To understand the significance of the Drop Site Massacre, you need to understand the context in which it occurred. When the first reports of Horus's treachery reached Terra, the Imperium's response was swift and decisive. Rogel Dawn, the Praetorian of Terra, ordered 7 Space Marine legions to the Istvan system to bring the War Master to account for his crimes. 3 legions, the Iron Hands, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard, would form the first wave, launching a direct assault on Horus's forces. 4 more legions, the Alpha Legion, the Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, and a large contingent of Word-Bearers would form the second wave. arriving as reinforcements to finish the job. What Dawn did not know, what the Emperor did not know, was that all 4 legions in the second wave had already secretly pledged their loyalty to Horus and were prepared to turn their weapons on their unsuspecting brothers at the most devastating possible moment. The first wave landed in the Urgal Depression, a vast canyon on the surface of Istvan 5, where Horus had established his primary defensive position. The fighting was brutal and confused, exactly as Horus intended. The Iron Hands, led by the implacable Ferrus Manus, drove deep into the traitor lines, their advance fueled by Ferrus's burning desire for vengeance against Fulgrim, who had tried to recruit him to the traitor cause and been violently rebuffed. The Salamanders and Raven Guard fought alongside them, pushing the traitor forces back with dogged determination. Then the second wave arrived. Hundreds of Stormbirds and Thunderhawks roared toward the surface, their armored hulls gleaming in the light of a dying sun. The sight of 4 more legions entering the battle should have been the moment when the Loyalists' victory became certain. Instead, it became the moment when everything fell apart. The second wave did not attack the traitors. They attacked the Loyalists. The Alpha Legion, alongside the Night Lords, Iron Warriors, and Wordbearers, turned their weapons on the very forces they were supposed to be reinforcing. The 3 Loyalist legions, already battered from hours of fighting against the initial traitor forces, found themselves caught in a devastating crossfire, attacked from behind by fresh troops who knew exactly where they were and exactly how to exploit their weakened positions. The slaughter was appalling. The Iron Hands were virtually annihilated. Ferrus Manus was killed by Fulgrim in personal combat, his head taken as a trophy. But the Salamanders were reduced from tens of thousands to a few hundred survivors. Their Primarch, Vulcan, went missing after a tactical nuclear strike hit his section of the battlefield and was presumed dead. The Raven Guard suffered catastrophic losses, reduced from around 80,000 warriors to roughly 3,000, their Primarch Corax severely wounded. It is widely believed that much of the strategy behind the drop site massacre was planned by Alpharius and the Alpha Legion. The meticulous preparation, the careful coordination of timing, the exploitation of the Loyalists' trust, all of these bore the hallmarks of the Alpha Legion's methodology. The harrowing, applied on a galactic scale, with entire Space Marine legions as the targets. But even in the midst of this terrible betrayal, there were signs that the Alpha Legion was not behaving like a typical traitor force. The most telling of these signs involves the Raven Guard and their Primarch, Corax. During the fighting on Istvan 5, the Raven Guard were on the verge of complete annihilation. Corax and his surviving Marines were surrounded, with no possibility of escape and no hope of reinforcement. By all rights, the 19th Legion should have died there on the black sands of Istvan 5, their gene seed lost forever, and their Primarch slain alongside his sons. But the Alpha Legion intervened, not to destroy the Raven Guard, but to save them. In a move that bewildered everyone who later analyzed the battle, Alpha Legion forces actively prevented World Eater's troops from reaching and destroying the surviving Raven Guard, and they even destroyed a World Eater's battle barge to ensure that Corax and his remaining warriors could be evacuated. When rescue ships arrived from Deliverance, the Raven Guard's homeworld, the Alpha Legion allowed them to extract the survivors without interference. Why? Why would a traitor legion, in the midst of the greatest betrayal in human history, go to such lengths to save a loyalist force that they had just been helping to destroy? The answer, of course, is that the Alpha Legion had plans for the Raven Guard. Plans that went far beyond the immediate battle. Plans that revealed the terrifying depth of the Alpha Legion's capacity for long-term strategic thinking. During the chaos of the drop site massacre, Alpha Legion troops had recovered the bodies of slain Raven Guard and surgically removed their faces. As these faces were then implanted onto Alpha Legion legionaries, allowing them to pass as survivors of the massacre. These surgically modified infiltrators were inserted into the Raven Guard's evacuation, mixing with the genuine survivors and embedding themselves deep within the 19th Legion's command structure. The reason for this elaborate infiltration became clear when Corax, devastated by the near destruction of his legion, returned to Terra to seek the Emperor's aid in rebuilding his forces. The Emperor, recognizing the desperate situation, granted Korax access to one of his most closely guarded secrets, the genetic material and technology left over from the Primarch project itself, the original program that had created the 20 Primarchs. Using this technology, Korax could potentially create a new generation of enhanced Space Marines, Raven Guard warriors with capabilities approaching those of the Primarchs themselves. The Alpha Legion knew this was going to happen. The Cabal had provided them with intelligence suggesting that Korax would be given access to this technology, and Omegon, operating personally on Kievar, the Forge world that orbited Deliverance, the Raven Guard's homeworld, was already in position to exploit the situation. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition and its ruthlessness. While Korax and his apothecaries worked to develop the new gene technology, creating enhanced warriors nicknamed Raptors, who showed astonishing potential, one of the Alpha Legion infiltrators within the Raven Guard sabotaged the process. Using a poison distilled from demon blood, the infiltrator tainted the gene code, causing subsequent batches of Raptors to develop horrific demonic mutations that rendered them monstrous abominations rather than the super soldiers Korax had been hoping to create. Simultaneously, Omegon and his operatives stole the genuine, uncorrupted gene technology for the Alpha Legion's own use. They used a manufactured rebellion by the old tech guilds of Kievar, whom Omegon had been cultivating as unwitting pawns, as a distraction to cover the theft. When the dust settled, the Raven Guard's hope of rapid rebuilding had been destroyed, and the Alpha Legion possessed one of the most valuable pieces of technology in the entire Imperium. But even here, the Alpha Legion's characteristic complexity was on display. When Horus demanded the stolen gene technology be delivered to him, the twins complied, but the copy they gave the War Master was a fake. The real technology remained in the Alpha Legion's possession, hidden away for purposes that have never been fully explained. The Raven Guard infiltration demonstrates everything that makes the Alpha Legion both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The patience of it, planning years in advance for a payoff that would come only after multiple intermediate steps had been successfully executed. The ruthlessness of it, destroying the hopes of a loyal legion and condemning thousands of newly created warriors to monstrous mutation for the sake of a strategic objective. And the duplicity of it, playing both sides simultaneously, appearing to serve Horus while actually pursuing their own agenda. After the Dropsite massacre, the Alpha Legion split from the main body of Horus's forces and embarked on a series of independent operations that further muddied the waters of their true allegiance. They did not join the War Master's drive toward Terra, the ultimate objective of the heresy. Instead, they scattered across the galaxy, conducting what appeared to be delaying actions against loyalist reinforcements, while simultaneously engaging in activities that seemed to serve no one's agenda but their own. At the Kondak system, where the White Scars were engaged in a campaign against Greenskin forces, the Alpha Legion was tasked by Horus with blockading the 5th Legion and either recruiting them to the traitor cause or preventing them from reaching Terra. What actually happened was considerably more complex. The Alpha Legion blockaded the White Scars long enough for them to receive a message from Rogel Dawn, warning of Horus's treachery, a message that could only be delivered because Omegon had dispatched forces to destroy an Alpha Legion-occupied communications array that was blocking White Scars' transmissions. Read that again. Omegon actively sabotaged his own Legion's operation to ensure that a loyalist force received critical intelligence. This was not the action of a committed traitor. This was the action of someone playing a game so complex that the distinction between loyalty and treason had become almost meaningless. The heresy ground on, a galaxy-spanning conflagration that consumed worlds and billions of lives. And through it all, the Alpha Legion moved like a ghost through the corridors of power and the killing fields of 100 contested worlds, serving no master but themselves and pursuing objectives that remained opaque even to their supposed allies. But the heresy was not done with the Alpha Legion yet. The most dramatic and consequential moment in the Legion's history was still to come, and it would take place not on some distant battlefield, but at the very doorstep of humanity's homeworld. Part 7. The Battle of Pluto, the Death of the Hydra Lord. As the Horus Heresy entered its final terrible phase, with the War Master's forces closing in on the Sol system, and the ultimate prize of Terra itself, the Alpha Legion was given one of the most critical assignments of the entire war. Horus charged Alpharius with plunging the Sol system into chaos in preparation for the main traitor assault, disrupting the Imperial defenses, destroying communications networks, and generally ensuring that when the War Master's armada arrived, Terra would be as vulnerable as possible. It was a mission perfectly suited to the Alpha Legion's capabilities, and Alpharius approached it with the thoroughness and audacity that had defined his legion's entire existence. What followed was one of the most elaborate and daring operations of the Horus Heresy, an infiltration so deep and so devastating that it shook the foundations of Terra's defenses. The operation began years before the actual attack, when Alpha Legion operatives and sleeper cells were planted throughout the Sol system. These agents were embedded in every level of Imperial society, from the lowest hab workers to the staff of major military installations. They were given hypnotic conditioning that allowed them to live entirely normal lives until the moment of activation, at which point they would awaken to their true purpose and carry out their assigned missions. When the time came, Alpharius put himself and the entire crew of his fleet into stasis. The fleet's vessels were powered down to the absolute minimum, reducing their heat signature to almost nothing. And then, in a feat of patience that perfectly encapsulated the Alpha Legion's approach to warfare, the fleet drifted toward the Sol system at minimum speed, taking an entire standard year to cover the distance. No warp travel, no faster-than-light jumps, just the cold, patient drift of powered-down warships through the void. It's invisible to the sensors that Rogel Dawn had so painstakingly positioned to detect exactly this kind of incursion. When the sleeper cells were finally activated, the effect was devastating. A freighter was detonated in orbit over Terra, raining debris and death across the surface of humanity's homeworld, killing millions. The Damocles starport, one of the primary entry points for traffic into the Sol system, was devastated by rebel cells. Riots erupted across Terran hive cities. Ships exploded, critical systems malfunctioned, and the Vox networks blazed with the name Lupercal, the War Master's name, screamed in defiance from 1,000 different locations simultaneously. But all of this was a distraction. Every explosion, every riot, yet every act of sabotage was designed to draw the attention of the Imperial defenders away from the Alpha Legion's true objective. Pluto. Pluto, the distant dwarf planet at the edge of the Sol system, was the linchpin of Rogel Dawn's defensive strategy. Its moon Hydra housed a massive astropathic monitoring station, the primary node in a surveillance network that allowed the Imperial fists to monitor all activity throughout the system. If Pluto fell, the defenders of Terra would be effectively blinded, unable to track the movements of the incoming traitor fleet, and unable to coordinate their defensive responses. And there was a symbolic dimension as well. Before the main assault, Alpha Legion infiltrators had penetrated the Investory, a chamber deep within the Imperial Palace that housed statues of all 20 Primarchs. In a move that was equal parts tactical disruption and psychological warfare, they destroyed every statue in the chamber except 2, the statues of Alpharius and Rogel Dawn. It was a message, a challenge, and a declaration of intent, all wrapped in a single act of audacious sabotage. Dawn was furious, but he was also, in his methodical way, impressed. He ordered the incident kept secret, refusing even to allow the Regent of Terra, Malkador the Sigillite, to see the damage. This was a matter between him and the Alpha Legion, and he would deal with it personally. The assault on Pluto began with a fleet action led by Harrow Master Kel Silonius, but this too was a deception within a deception. Silonius was, in fact, Alpharius himself. The Primarch had undergone a process of memory suppression. He is temporarily wiping his own memories and assuming Silonius's identity so completely that even a psychic scan would not have detected the deception. Each time Alfarius encountered another Alpha Legion operative during the infiltration, an exchange of passwords served as a trigger to unlock another layer of his suppressed memories, gradually restoring his full identity as the operation progressed. Think about that for a moment. The Primarch of the 20th Legion deliberately erased his own memories, becoming a different person entirely as part of an infiltration operation. This is the kind of commitment to deception that goes beyond mere tactical planning. It speaks to a fundamental relationship with identity itself that is alien to the mindset of any other Primarch, and perhaps any other being in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. As the battle raged across Pluto's moons, with Alpha Legion forces capturing key positions while Imperial Fist's defenders fought desperately to hold them, the true Alpha Legion fleet arrived in system. Over 200 ships, led by Alfarius's flagship the Alpha, engaged the Imperial defenses. Sigismund, the legendary Imperial Fists champion who commanded the outer defensive perimeter, discovered to his horror that many of the Alpha Legion ships contained nothing but servitors, empty vessels sent as decoys to draw his forces out of position while the real assault struck Pluto. On the surface of Hydra, Pluto's fortress moon, Alfarius and his headhunters fought their way toward the astropathic monitoring station. The Alpha Legion operative, Maismadra, and her psyker companion Incarnus had already infiltrated the facility, murdering the astropaths and taking control of the communications hub. Everything was proceeding according to plan. And then Rogel Dawn arrived, the Praetorian of Terror, realizing at the last moment that Pluto was the true target of the Alpha Legion's assault, executed a brilliant slingshot maneuver, using Sol's gravity wells to catapult his flagship, the Phalanx, to the edge of the system at extraordinary speed. He teleported directly onto the surface of Hydra with his Huskarl bodyguard, the elite of the Imperial Fists, and marched into the fortress to confront Alfarius personally. The duel that followed was epic in its intensity and tragic in its implications. Alfarius fought with the Pale Spear, a weapon of unknown origin whose power rivaled any artifact in the Imperium's arsenal. Dawn wielded Storm's Teeth, his massive chainsword, his with the grim determination that had made him the Empire's greatest defender. Around them, Lenean Terminators clashed with Huskarl veterans, the finest warriors of both legions tearing each other apart in the cramped corridors of the Fortress Moon. Throughout the fight, Alfarius tried to communicate with Dawn. He claimed that he was not there to destroy the Praetorian, but to teach him, to expose the weaknesses in his defensive strategy so that they could be corrected. He insisted that he did not fight for Horus, but for Dawn himself, that they both cared about the future, that only Alfarius understood the true nature of the conflict. Dawn listened. And then, in a moment of devastating tactical brilliance, the Praetorian of Terror proved that he understood the Alpha Legion better than Alfarius had given him credit for. When Alfarius lunged with the Pale Spear, aiming for a killing blow, Dawn deliberately stepped into the strike. He allowed the spear to pierce his shoulder, tanking the wound to pin Alfarius in place. Then, with his free hand, Dawn grabbed the haft of the spear, and with Storm's Teeth, he cut through Alfarius's wrists, severing both hands from his arms. Before the Primarch could react, Dawn slashed him across the chest, impaled him with his own spear, and finished the job by cutting through Alfarius's skull with his chainsword. The Primarch of the Alpha Legion was dead. Far away, across the void, Omegon felt the death of his twin. The sensation was like a severing, a tearing away of something fundamental. For the first time in his existence, Omegon was alone, half of a soul suddenly forced to function as a whole. In the moments that followed, he made a decision that would define the Alpha Legion for the next 10,000 years. He took his brother's name. When Horus demanded to speak with Alfarius, it was Omegon who answered the call, wearing his dead brother's identity like a mask. The surviving twin became Alfarius. and the Legion continued without missing a step. On the surface, nothing had changed. The Hydra had lost a head, but the body lived on, as it had always been designed to do. Dawn, for his part, chose to keep Alfarius's death a secret. He promoted the surviving members of his Huskarl bodyguard, who had witnessed the event, ensuring their silence, and denied Alfarius any acknowledgement or honor. The Praetorian of Terror did not want the Alpha Legion to receive even the dignity of having their Primarch's death recognized, or he wanted to deny them everything, even the satisfaction of being known. It was, in its own way, the most Alpha Legion thing that Rogel Dawn ever did. Part 8. After the Heresy, the Great Scouring, Escrador, and the Fracturing. The Horus Heresy ended as the Cabal had predicted it would, with the Emperor's forces victorious, but at a cost so devastating that victory felt indistinguishable from defeat. The Emperor was mortally wounded in his final confrontation with Horus aboard the War Master's battle barge and was interred upon the Golden Throne, the psychic life support system that would sustain his broken body for the next 10,000 years. The traitor legions were driven back in a massive counteroffensive known as the Great Scouring, pursued across the galaxy by loyalist forces burning with righteous fury. Most of the traitor legions retreated to the Eye of Terror, the massive warp rift at the galaxy's heart, where the laws of physics gave way to the caprice of the Chaos Gods. There, protected by the reality-warping energies of the warp, they licked their wounds, rebuilt their strength, and prepared for the eternal war against the Imperium that would define the next 10 millennia. The Alpha Legion, characteristically, did something different. Rather than fleeing to the Eye of Terror, the Alpha Legion moved in the opposite direction, pushing into the galactic east and pursuing objectives of their own. Whether bringing themselves into conflict with the Ultramarines was one of these objectives is unknown, but it happened nonetheless. And the resulting engagement would become one of the most significant and hotly debated events in the Alpha Legion's history. On the world of Escrador, the Alpha Legion was confronted by a large Ultramarines force, led by Roboute Guilliman himself. According to most accounts, the Primarch calling himself Alfarius, who was almost certainly Omegon wearing his dead brother's name, was reportedly pleased by this development. Here was an opportunity to demonstrate the superiority of the Alpha Legion's flexible, multifaceted approach to warfare against the Ultramarines' more rigid, doctrine-driven methods. The same argument that had begun between Alfarius and Guilliman decades earlier during the Great Crusade would finally be settled on the battlefield. Alfarius, or rather Omegon as Alfarius, deployed his forces in the classic Alpha Legion fashion, spreading them across multiple positions, creating diversions and feints, preparing a web of ambushes and counter-ambushes designed to confuse and overwhelm the Ultramarines' systematic approach to combat. Guilliman did something that no one, least of all the Alpha Legion, expected. He abandoned his own playbook. Rather than responding to the Alpha Legion's provocations with the measured, methodical approach that had characterized the Ultramarines throughout their existence, Guilliman led a sudden, devastating assault by his elite units directly against the Alpha Legion's headquarters. It was a tactic that Guilliman himself would normally have condemned as reckless and undisciplined. It was exactly the kind of bold, unpredictable strike that the Alpha Legion would have been proud to execute, and it worked. In the resulting personal combat between Guilliman and the Primarch of the Alpha Legion, it is believed that the being calling himself Alfarius was killed. Whether this was the real Omegon, wearing his brother's name, or yet another substitute in the long chain of deceptions that the Alpha Legion had perfected, remains one of the most debated questions in 40k lore. What is known is that the Alpha Legion's response to their supposed Primarch's death was startling and entirely in character. They did not break, they did not flee, they did not collapse into the kind of leadership vacuum that would have paralyzed any other legion that lost its commanding officer. Instead, they turned on Guilliman's detachment with such ferocious determination that by the time the Ultramarines had fought their way back to their main force, their casualties were almost total. The Alpha Legion had lost their Primarch, or at least the being everyone believed was their Primarch, and they had responded by mauling one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy so badly that it needed to retreat. This was the Hydra in action. Cut off one head, and the others continued to fight with undiminished fury. The Alpha Legion had been designed from the ground up to survive the loss of any individual, including its Primarch. The collective identity, the shared purpose, the I am Alpharius philosophy that made every warrior a potential leader, proved its worth in the most dramatic way possible. After Escrador, and the Alpha Legion fractured. But this was not the disintegration of a defeated force. It was a deliberate strategic decision. Small, autonomous warbands spread across Imperial space, establishing hidden bases in asteroid fields, on space hulks, and on barren worlds where the Imperium's attention was unlikely to be focused. Each warband operated independently, pursuing its own objectives, while maintaining some degree of coordination with the larger whole. This fragmentation served multiple purposes. It made the Alpha Legion almost impossible to locate and destroy as a unified force. It allowed the Legion to maintain a presence across a vast area of space, far larger than any other traitor Legion could cover. And it created a network of semi-independent cells that could be activated or directed as circumstances demanded. Guess a galaxy-spanning intelligence and sabotage network that continued to operate for thousands of years after the heresy's end. Unlike most of the other Chaos Space Marine legions, the Alpha Legion rarely operates within the Eye of Terror itself. This is a detail of enormous significance that is sometimes overlooked, because it has a direct bearing on one of the most puzzling aspects of the Legion's continued existence. The Eye of Terror and other major warp rifts like the Maelstrom are places where the boundary between real space and the warp is thin or non-existent. Time flows differently there, if it flows at all. For the traitor legions that retreated into the Eye after the heresy, thousands of years of real space-time might correspond to only centuries or decades or even years of subjective experience. But this is how many Chaos Space Marines from the heresy era are still alive and active in the 41st and 42nd millennia. They have not experienced 10,000 years of existence. They have experienced far less, their perception of time dilated and warped by the chaotic energies of the warp. The Alpha Legion, by contrast, has spent the vast majority of the last 10 millennia operating in real space, where time flows normally and the passage of years is experienced in full. This raises a question that has puzzled Imperial scholars and inquisitors for thousands of years. How has the Alpha Legion maintained its numbers and its capability over such an extended period, when the normal attrition of warfare, aging, and equipment degradation should have ground them down to nothing long ago? Several possible explanations have been proposed. And one is that the Alpha Legion has continued to recruit new members throughout its post-heresy existence, drawing aspirants from the populations of the worlds where its warbands maintain a presence. This is not unprecedented among Chaos Space Marine forces, but it requires access to gene seed and the technical knowledge to implant it, resources that become increasingly difficult to maintain outside the support structures of a Forge world or a Legion's traditional apothecary infrastructure. Another possibility is that the Alpha Legion's gene seed is particularly stable and resilient, producing Space Marines with extended lifespans even by the already impressive standards of the Astartes. There is some evidence for this in the observation that Alpha Legion warriors tend to be less physically corrupted than their counterparts in other traitor legions, suggesting that their gene seed has resisted the mutating influence of chaos more effectively than most. A third, more disturbing possibility is that the Alpha Legion's continued strength is itself an illusion, a carefully maintained deception designed to make the Imperium believe that the Legion is far more numerous and capable than it actually is. Given the Alpha Legion's expertise in manipulation and misdirection, it is entirely plausible that a relatively small force could create the impression of a much larger one through the strategic deployment of feints, false flag operations, and the exploitation of confusion and fear. The truth probably involves some combination of all three explanations, varying from warband to warband and from era to era. The Alpha Legion has never been a monolithic force, and its individual warbands have likely adopted different survival strategies, depending on their circumstances and resources. The organizational structure of the post-heresy Alpha Legion deserves examination. Each warband is typically led by a Chaos Lord, or, in the Alpha Legion's distinctive terminology, a Harrow Master. This title, which harkens back to the harrowing tactics that defined the Legion during the Great Crusade, is more than just an honorific. A Harrow Master is expected to be a complete military commander, capable of planning and executing the kind of multi-layered, multi-phase operations that are the Alpha Legion's hallmark. Below the Harrow Master, as the warband is organized into cells that operate with significant autonomy, each cell might specialize in a particular aspect of the Alpha Legion's operational repertoire: reconnaissance, sabotage, direct action, or intelligence analysis, and cells are combined and recombined as the demands of specific operations require. This modular structure allows even a relatively small warband to project an outsized influence because each cell can operate independently across a wide area while still contributing to the Harrow Master's overall strategic plan. When an ambitious enough plan or an especially tempting opportunity presents itself, multiple Alpha Legion cells and warbands may unite temporarily under the command of a single Harrow Master. These temporary coalitions can bring together hundreds or even thousands of warriors, creating a force capable of threatening major Imperial installations or even entire planetary systems. But these coalitions are, by their nature, temporary. Once the immediate objective has been achieved, the warbands disperse again, returning to their individual bases and resuming their independent operations. This cycle of dispersal and concentration is central to the Alpha Legion's long-term survival strategy. By never maintaining a concentrated force for longer than necessary, they ensure that the Imperium can never deliver a single decisive blow against the Legion as a whole. Even if a major coalition is defeated and its component warbands suffer heavy losses, the broader network survives and new warbands can be formed from the scattered survivors. The Alpha Legion's warbands engaged in a wide range of activities, and some launched direct military strikes against Imperial targets weakened by the heresy. Others infiltrated Imperial organizations, planting agents at every level of government, military, and religious authority. Still others coordinated chaos cults throughout the galaxy, using these cults as tools to destabilize Imperial worlds and draw Imperial military forces away from areas where the Alpha Legion wanted to operate. This last activity, the seeding and coordination of chaos cults, earned the Alpha Legion the particular loathing of the Inquisition. The Ordo Malleus and Ordo Hereticus devoted enormous resources to tracking and eliminating Alpha Legion cells and the cults they sponsored. These efforts met with mixed success. The Alpha Legion's operational security was excellent, their compartmentalization was effective, and their willingness to sacrifice lower-level assets to protect higher-level operations made them extraordinarily difficult to uproot. The High Lords of Terror declared the Alpha Legion destroyed 3 separate times, in the 31st Millennium, the 32nd Millennium, and the 39th Millennium. Each time, the declaration proved premature. The Alpha Legion was not the kind of enemy that could be defeated by killing its leaders or destroying its bases. It was an idea as much as an organization, a methodology of warfare that could survive and regenerate even after what appeared to be total annihilation. One particularly telling example of the Alpha Legion's approach to long-term operations involves a warband led by Harrow Master Quetzal Carthak. Al-Carthak claimed to have been present at Escrador when Gilliman killed the being claiming to be Alfarius, and he declared himself the foremost enemy of the Ultramarines and all their successor chapters. Carthak's campaign against the Crimson Consuls, an Ultramarines' successor chapter, was a masterpiece of Alpha Legion methodology. Rather than confronting the chapter in open battle, Carthag's operatives infiltrated the chapter's recruitment process and hypno-indoctrinated their aspirants with a concealed trigger phrase. When the trigger was activated, the chapter tore itself apart from within, its own newly inducted members turning on their brothers in a paroxysm of programmed violence. The Alpha Legion assault that followed was almost superfluous. By the time Carthag's warriors arrived, the Crimson Consuls were already destroying themselves. The complete annihilation of an entire Space Marine chapter through a single act of infiltration. That was what the Alpha Legion was capable of, even 10,000 years after the heresy, even fragmented into dozens of independent warbands, even without a Primarch to guide them. In the 42nd millennium, with the galaxy shattered by the Great Rift and the Imperium facing threats on every front, the Alpha Legion remains as active and as enigmatic as ever. A Harrowmaster named Solomon Akora, wielding the Pale Spear, the very weapon that Alpharius once carried, has established a significant coalition of Alpha Legion warbands, known as the Ghost Legion. This coalition represents one of the largest concentrations of Alpha Legion strength seen since the heresy, and its objectives are true to form, completely unknown to the Imperium. Some warbands appear to operate as straightforward enemies of the Imperium, launching raids, sponsoring insurrections, and generally behaving like any other Chaos warband. Others seem to target Chaos-aligned forces as often as Imperial ones, conducting operations that make no sense from the perspective of either side of the eternal war. A few, whispered about in the most classified inquisitorial reports, appear to be actively working to protect the Imperium from threats that the Imperium itself does not even know exist. The Alpha Legion has become, in the 10,000 years since the heresy, something that goes beyond the concept of a military force. It is a phenomenon, a distributed intelligence network that spans the galaxy, pursuing objectives that may have been set in motion during the Great Crusade and that will not reach fruition for centuries or millennia to come. It is the ultimate expression of the long game, a patient, methodical, impossibly complex web of schemes and counter-schemes that may, in the end, prove to be either humanity's greatest threat or its hidden salvation. Part 9. Loyal or Traitor? The question that cannot be answered. And so we arrive at the question that has haunted the Alpha Legion since the moment of their betrayal. A question that 10,000 years of war and deception have done nothing to resolve. Were the Alpha Legion truly traitors? Or were they the most dedicated loyalists the Imperium has ever known, playing a role so deep and so demanding that it cost them everything, their honor, their brothers, their Primarchs, and any possibility of ever being recognized for what they truly were? Let us examine the evidence on both sides, because there is compelling material pointing in each direction. The case for treason is, on the surface, straightforward. The Alpha Legion fought alongside Horus at the Drop Site Massacre. They participated in the slaughter of loyalist Space Marines. They sabotaged the Raven Guard's Gene Seed program. They attempted to cripple Terra's defenses during the Battle of Pluto. In the 10,000 years since the heresy, their warbands have coordinated chaos cults, launched attacks on Imperial worlds, and caused untold destruction to the Imperium they once served. By any conventional measure, these are the actions of traitors. The Imperium certainly classifies them as such. And the Alpha Legion is officially listed among the 9 traitor legions in every Imperial record that acknowledges their existence. But look closer, and the picture becomes considerably more complicated. Start with the Cabal's revelation. The twin Primarchs were presented with evidence from an organization with thousands of years of predictive capability that a loyalist victory in the heresy would lead to the slow, agonizing destruction of the entire galaxy. If the Cabal's predictions were accurate, then the Alpha Legion's decision to support Horus was not an act of treason, but an act of ultimate sacrifice, a willingness to damn themselves in the eyes of the Imperium in order to pursue the only course of action that might save the galaxy from chaos. Their cry of, "The Alpha Legion has always been for the Emperor," was not the desperate rationalization of turncoats. It was a genuine statement of loyalty from beings who believed they were serving the Emperor's deepest wishes, even as they raised their weapons against his forces. Then look at their behavior during the heresy itself. The Alpha Legion was, at best, an unreliable traitor. They saved the Raven Guard when they could have annihilated them. They allowed the White Scars to receive Dawn's warning about Horus's treachery when they were supposed to be blocking communications. They gave Horus a fake copy of the stolen gene technology. They never dedicated themselves to any of the Chaos Gods. They never performed the kinds of dark rituals or demonic bargains that characterize the other traitor legions. And they refused to participate in the Siege of Terror, at the defining battle of the entire heresy, choosing instead to pursue their own objectives, far from the fighting. Even Omegon's behavior after Alpharius's death supports the loyalist interpretation. When Horus demanded that Alpharius bring the Alpha Legion to Terra for the final assault, Omegon complied only to the extent of giving Horus a detailed map of the Sol System's defenses, essentially providing the War Master with intelligence that would have been valuable for the attack, and then withdrew the entire Legion from the traitor war effort. He handed Horus a gift and then walked away, taking the Alpha Legion out of the war at the most critical moment. This is not the behavior of a legion committed to Horus's victory. This is the behavior of a legion that was playing both sides, using its position within the traitor forces to gather intelligence and influence events, while never fully committing to either side's ultimate objectives. On the other hand, the case against the Alpha Legion's supposed loyalty is also compelling. If they were truly working for the Emperor, why did they participate in the drop site massacre at all? They could have warned the Loyalist First Wave about the trap. They could have turned on the other traitor legions at the critical moment, potentially changing the entire course of the battle. Instead, they fought alongside the traitors and helped slaughter tens of thousands of their brothers. The sabotage of the Raven Guard's gene seed program is even harder to justify from a loyalist perspective, destroying one of the Emperor's own technological secrets. Corrupting the gene seed that could have rebuilt a shattered legion, depriving the Imperium of a strategic asset that might have helped turn the tide of the war. These are not the actions of loyal servants of the Emperor, no matter how convoluted their long-term strategy might have been. And then there is the matter of the Chaos cults. In the 10,000 years since the heresy, Alpha Legion warbands have coordinated and sponsored Chaos cults across the galaxy, organizations that worship the dark gods and cause immense suffering to the populations they corrupt. How does this serve the Emperor's cause? How does spreading the influence of chaos align with a goal of ultimately defeating it? The most honest answer is that we do not know. We cannot know, because the Alpha Legion has made absolutely certain that the truth remains hidden. And that, paradoxically, might be the strongest argument in favor of their loyalty. Consider, if the Alpha Legion had genuinely turned to chaos, there would be no reason to maintain the ambiguity. They could openly worship the dark gods, as the word-bearers do. They could dedicate themselves to a specific patron, as the World Eaters have done with Khorne. They could embrace the gifts of mutation and demonic power that the warp offers to its most devoted servants. But they do not. The Alpha Legion, as a whole, maintains an arm's-length relationship with chaos that is unique among the traitor legions. Individual warriors may fall to corruption. Some warbands have certainly embraced the dark powers more fully than others, but the Legion as a whole has never pledged itself to any chaos god. But their use of chaos seems pragmatic rather than devotional, a tool to be employed when useful rather than a creed to be followed. This distance from chaos is significant because the warp is not kind to those who half commit. The chaos gods do not tolerate servants who serve only when it suits them. Over 10,000 years, the psychological and spiritual pressures of operating in proximity to chaos should have corrupted the Alpha Legion beyond recognition, transforming them into something as debased and twisted as any other traitor legion. But they remain, for the most part, remarkably uncorrupted. Their gene seed is reportedly among the purest of any traitor legion. Their warriors do not display the extreme mutations and demonic transformations that characterize many of their former brothers. They continue to think clearly, to plan strategically, to operate with a level of discipline and coordination that would be impossible for beings fully in the thrall of chaos. This purity could be attributed to their operational methodology, the fact that they operate primarily in real space rather than within the Eye of Terror, where the corrupting influence of the warp is strongest. But it could also suggest something deeper, a commitment to a cause that transcends the binary of loyalist versus traitor, a purpose that requires them to remain uncorrupted in order to be fulfilled. There is one more piece of evidence worth considering, and it comes from the very structure of the Alpha Legion's operations in the modern setting. Reports persist of Alpha Legion warbands conducting operations that benefit the Imperium, Salmon, i.e. chaos cults eliminated before they can grow strong enough to threaten Imperial worlds. Tyranid splinter fleets diverted from their intended targets. Orc migrations disrupted before they can build into full-scale crusades. These operations are never acknowledged by the Alpha Legion and are rarely detected by Imperial forces, but the patterns are there for those with the knowledge to look for them. Are these the actions of traitors? Or are they the actions of a deep cover force so thoroughly embedded in its role that even 10,000 years of apparent treachery have not shaken its fundamental loyalty? The beauty of the Alpha Legion, from a storytelling perspective, is that this question is genuinely unanswerable. Games Workshop has deliberately constructed the Alpha Legion's lore so that both interpretations are simultaneously valid, and every piece of evidence that supports the loyalist theory can be reinterpreted through a traitor lens, and every piece of evidence that supports the traitor theory can be reinterpreted through a loyalist one. The ambiguity is not a flaw in the writing. It is the point. The Alpha Legion is the embodiment of the idea that in a galaxy as vast and as morally complex as the one depicted in Warhammer 40,000, the concepts of loyal and traitor are insufficient to capture the full spectrum of possible motivations and allegiances. Maybe the Alpha Legion is loyal, maybe they are traitors, maybe they were once loyal and have lost their way over 10,000 years of operating without their Primarch's guidance. Maybe different warbands have taken different paths, and some remaining true to the original purpose, while others have genuinely fallen to chaos. Maybe the original purpose itself was flawed, based on predictions from the Cabal that may not have been accurate, and the Alpha Legion has been pursuing a doomed strategy for 10 millennia. Or maybe, just maybe, everything is going exactly according to plan. A plan set in motion before the heresy began, a plan so vast and so complex that even the Alpha Legion's own members do not fully understand it, a plan that will not reach its culmination for centuries or millennia yet to come. Hydra Dominatus, the Hydra endures, and its true purpose remains its own. There is an additional layer to this mystery that deserves exploration, and it concerns the internal divisions within the Alpha Legion itself. Because even if we accept that Alpharius and Omegon had a coherent plan when they sided with Horus, there is no guarantee that every member of the Legion understood or agreed with that plan. The Alpha Legion's own culture of compartmentalization meant that individual legionaries often operated without full knowledge of the larger strategic picture. Some may have genuinely believed they were fighting for chaos. Others may have believed they were secret loyalists. Others still may have been pursuing their own agendas entirely, taking advantage of the Legion's decentralized structure to carve out personal domains of power. This internal fragmentation has only intensified over the 10,000 years since the heresy. Without a Primarch to provide unified direction, and with individual warbands separated by vast distances and minimal communication, the Alpha Legion has inevitably diversified in its beliefs and motivations. Some warbands have fallen genuinely to chaos, their members seduced by the dark powers over centuries of exposure. The Daggerfangs, for instance, were a warband that became more devoted to the Chaos Gods than their peers, eventually assaulting Fenris in a misguided attack that ended in total defeat at the hands of the Space Wolves. At the other extreme, There are persistent and tantalizing reports of Alpha Legion warbands that appear to operate as genuine loyalists. These groups target Chaos-aligned forces as often as Imperial ones, conducting operations that seem designed to protect the Imperium from threats it does not even know exist. Yet they eliminate emerging daemon cults before they can grow strong enough to threaten populated worlds. They sabotage Chaos incursions from within, using their position among the traitor legions to disrupt the plans of warlords and demon princes. They feed intelligence to Imperial forces through channels so convoluted that the recipients never realize where the information is coming from. One of the most fascinating Alpha Legion figures to emerge in the post-heresy era is Occam the Untrue, a warband leader whose very name suggests a philosophical commitment to deception. Occam led a group called the Redacted, a designation that perfectly captures the Alpha Legion's relationship to official records and established history. The Redacted operated in the grey zone between loyalty and treason, as carrying out missions whose true purpose was known only to Occam himself, and perhaps not even to him, given the Alpha Legion's tradition of suppressed memories and layered deceptions. Then, there is the figure of Solomon Akura, who carries the Pale Spear, the very weapon that once belonged to Alpharius himself. Akura's Ghost Legion coalition, established in the 42nd Millennium, represents the largest known concentration of Alpha Legion's strength since the heresy, and its emergence raises more questions than it answers. Why now? What objective demands the coordination of multiple warbands under a single command? And what does it mean that the warrior leading this coalition wields the weapon of a dead Primarch? Some inquisitors have theorized that the Pale Spear itself carries some form of psychic imprint, and a residue of Alpharius's consciousness that guides whoever wields it. Others believe that the spear is simply a symbol, a rallying point, around which disparate Alpha Legion forces can unite. Still others, the most paranoid and perhaps the most perceptive, believe that the emergence of the Ghost Legion is the activation of a contingency plan that has been dormant for thousands of years, a response to some specific trigger condition that was programmed into the Alpha Legion's operational doctrine during the Great Crusade, and has only now been met. The Alpha Legion's relationship with the other traitor legions is also worth examining, because it offers additional insight into their true motivations. Most traitor legions have strong, if often antagonistic, relationships with each other. The World Eaters despise the Emperor's children. The Thousand Sons and the Space Wolves remain locked in a grudge match that spans 10 millennia. The Word-Bearers consider themselves the first and truest servants of Chaos, and they regard the other traitor legions with a mixture of contempt and evangelical zeal. The Alpha Legion stands apart from all of this. They have no particular loyalty to any other traitor legion, and no particular grudge against any of them either. They cooperate with other Chaos forces when it serves their purposes, and oppose them with equal readiness when it does not. They have been known to infiltrate other traitor legions just as readily as they infiltrate Imperial organizations, placing agents within the warbands of their supposed allies to gather intelligence and manipulate events. This willingness to target their own side is one of the most telling aspects of the Alpha Legion's behavior. Genuine traitors, beings who had truly committed themselves to the cause of Chaos, would not routinely betray and manipulate their fellow servants of the Dark Powers. The fact that the Alpha Legion does so suggests that they do not consider themselves to be on the same side as the other traitor legions at all. They are using the cover of traitor status to pursue an agenda that has nothing to do with serving Chaos, and everything to do with some larger, as yet unrevealed objective. Of course, this interpretation has its own problems. It assumes a level of coordination and long-term planning that may be impossible for an organization that has been fragmented and leaderless for 10,000 years. And it assumes that the original purpose set by Alpharius and Omegon has been faithfully preserved and transmitted across hundreds of generations of legionaries without being distorted or lost. And it assumes that the Cabal's predictions, on which the twins based their original decision, were accurate enough to justify the extraordinary sacrifices that their chosen course of action has demanded. There is a possibility that fans of the Alpha Legion sometimes find uncomfortable to contemplate, and it is this. What if the twins were wrong? What if the Cabal's predictions were flawed, or deliberately misleading, or simply incomplete? What if the choice to side with Horus was, in the final analysis, a mistake? One made by beings who were too clever and too confident in their own judgment to recognize that they were being manipulated. And the Cabal's track record offers some support for this interpretation. Their acuity, for all its sophistication, was not infallible. They failed to foresee the existence of the Nerthan Black Cube, a chaos weapon that appeared in the conflict on Nerth. They failed to predict that Eldrad Ulthran would turn against them and destroy their organization. And their central prediction, that a Horus victory would lead to the destruction of chaos, was based on assumptions about Horus's psychology that may not have been accurate. If the Cabal was wrong, then the Alpha Legion's entire rationale for siding with the War Master collapses. They betrayed the Emperor for nothing. They participated in the slaughter of their brothers for nothing. They condemned themselves to 10,000 years of exile and conflict for nothing. Yet the sacrifice that they believed was the highest expression of loyalty to the Emperor's vision was, in fact, simply treason, made more tragic by the genuine sincerity of the motivations behind it. This possibility gives the Alpha Legion's story a layer of genuine pathos that is often overlooked in favor of the more exciting, secret loyalist narrative. The Alpha Legion might not be brilliant chess masters playing a game that spans millennia. They might be victims of their own hubris, beings who were so convinced of their own intellectual superiority that they allowed themselves to be played by an alien organization with its own agenda. The Hydra might not be a symbol of unstoppable resilience and infinite adaptability, and it might be a symbol of an organization that is trapped in a pattern of self-deception so deep that it can never find its way out. That possibility, the idea that the Alpha Legion might be both tragic and admirable, both brilliant and deeply foolish, is part of what makes them such a rich and compelling part of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Part 10. The Enduring Legacy. What makes the Alpha Legion so compelling? As we come to the end of our journey through the labyrinthine history of the Alpha Legion, it is worth stepping back and asking a broader question. Why does this faction resonate so deeply with so many fans of the Warhammer 40,000 setting? Part of the answer lies in the sheer quality of the lore. The Alpha Legion's story is one of the best written and most thoughtfully constructed narratives in the entire 40k canon. As from Dan Abnett's groundbreaking novel Legion, which introduced the Cabal and the twin Primarchs, to John French's Praetorian of Dawn, which gave us the devastating Battle of Pluto, to Mike Brooks's Alfarius, head of the Hydra, which recontextualized the Primarch's entire origin story. The Black Library authors who have tackled the Alpha Legion have consistently produced some of the finest work in the Horus Heresy series. But it goes deeper than that. The Alpha Legion speaks to something fundamental about the way we understand conflict, loyalty, and identity. In a setting that often deals in moral absolutes, where the forces of order battle the forces of chaos in a struggle for the soul of the galaxy, the Alpha Legion represents the uncomfortable truth that reality is rarely that simple. Our good people can do terrible things for reasons they believe are justified. Loyalty can take forms that are indistinguishable from betrayal, and the most dangerous enemies are not the ones who hate you, but the ones who believe they are helping you by destroying everything you hold dear. The Alpha Legion also resonates because of what they represent in terms of power dynamics. They are the proof that in a universe dominated by brute force, by titans and Terminator armor and planet-killing weapons, the most dangerous weapon is still information. A single, well-placed operative can accomplish what an entire fleet of warships cannot. A whispered word in the right ear can topple an empire that 1 million soldiers could not conquer. But the Alpha Legion is the answer to the question of what happens when you apply the principles of intelligence warfare to a setting where the stakes are measured in the deaths of worlds and the fates of species. And then there is the appeal of the mystery itself. In an age of instant information, where every question seems to have an answer a few keystrokes away. There is something deeply satisfying about a story that refuses to give you a clean resolution. The Alpha Legion invites you to engage with its lore not as a passive consumer, but as an active participant, sifting through contradictory accounts and unreliable narrators, forming your own theories and defending them against equally valid counter-arguments. The Alpha Legion is, in a very real sense, the faction that makes you think. And in a hobby that can sometimes lean heavily on the visceral thrill of massive battles and apocalyptic destruction, that intellectual dimension is a welcome and valuable addition. Their symbol, the multi-headed Hydra, is perhaps the most perfect emblem in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. It captures everything about them in a single image. Their resilience, their adaptability, their refusal to be defined by any single head or any single narrative. Cut off one interpretation, and two more take its place. Destroy one warband, and the network endures. Kill their Primarch, and the Legion carries on, bearing his name as if he had never fallen. The Alpha Legion endures because the galaxy is, at its core, a place of secrets. Every great power, from the Emperor on his golden throne to the Chaos Gods in their warped domains, is built upon layers of hidden truth and deliberate deception. In such a universe, the Alpha Legion is not an aberration. They are the natural and inevitable product of their environment, the faction that saw the galaxy's addiction to secrecy and decided to become its undisputed masters. And somewhere in the vast darkness between the stars, in hidden bases on forgotten worlds, in the corridors of imperial palaces where their operatives walk unseen, in the war councils of chaos warbands where their agents whisper poisoned advice, the Alpha Legion continues its eternal mission. Whether that mission serves the Emperor, or chaos, or something else entirely, is a question that may never be answered. But then again, that might be exactly what they want. Thank you so much for joining me tonight for this deep exploration into the Alpha Legion, the most mysterious and most maddening faction in all of Warhammer 40,000. If you enjoyed this journey through deception and shadow and impossible choices, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really does make an enormous difference, and it helps more people find content just like this. If you have your own theories about the Alpha Legion's true loyalties, drop them in the comments. I would love to hear what you think. Are they loyal? Are they traitors? Are they something else entirely that we have not even considered? Let me know. And remember, I am Alfarius, and so are you. Until next time. Hydra Dominatus.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.